Good morning. It's great to see you all again. It's really a pleasure to recognize you all and chat and see how beautifully we all can engage with each other about this question of images that guide us all and sometimes misguide us. Our next speaker is going to be announced very shortly, but before I wanted to do that, I wanted to quickly point you to the fact that we live in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, there's a lot of issues with location, as tech companies sometimes generate salaries that are not the same as the salaries people who live here for a long time have, and there's a lot of dislocation happening. And I would be amiss to have a conference about image as location without speaking about dislocation. And to that end, I wanted to point out that our MFA student and amazing artist Leslie Dreyer made an installation at the Free Speech Cafe about disrupting dislocation. And she is an artist who was involved in the Google bus protests, and in fact, these signs here were made by her, and they're now her studio artwork as well as her protest work. And so if you have time after the conference to swing by the Free Speech Cafe, there's an installation there about her Disrupt project, which involves bricks. Next slide. This is a very special honor for me because I get to introduce my dear wife, Monica. And I have precise instructions, which I will follow here. So Monica is a documentary filmmaker and journalist who has traveled on 5 continents telling stories from places like South Africa, Cuba, I remember that one, China, and even the remote Faroe Islands. I definitely remember that one. And she's currently a television producer at KQED, the Bay Area's public broadcasting station. And she just got an award this morning. You told me you got an award from the Society for Professional Journalists for the project called The Hidden Genius, a multi-platform piece about improving diversity in technology. And her talk today is titled Making the Inaccessible Public. And I want to credit you, Monica, for bringing about this whole conference, because you filmed a place that we can't see in any other way, or access in any other way but through an image. And so I'm very excited about introducing you today. Please welcome Monica Lamb.
Thank you. I didn't know that I deserve credit for this conference. And
there it is.
Okay. Yes, my name is Monica. The artist before me talked about strange spaces that you can't, that change how we think about the world. I'm going to talk about small, confined spaces, in particular spaces that some people don't ever get to enter and some people don't ever get to leave. That is prison. I've gone inside many prisons with a camera as a filmmaker and a journalist to bring those images back out for others to see. Some of my work is investigative, where I'm going in to find out things people don't necessarily want you to know about. But some of it is just that images of prison are what allows most of us to understand it as a location. There are a lot of hoops to jump through to get inside a prison the right way, that is, not as a convict or as a family member of a convict. The prison system has its own set of rules about who gets to go in. They are mostly pretty straightforward, but a lot of it is at the discretion of administrators, wardens, public information officers. You submit to a background check. You submit a list of your equipment. You leave your cell phone in your car in the parking lot, and you have to dress a certain way. You can't wear red or blue or orange, because you might look like an inmate, or those could be interpreted as gang colors. You also can't wear dark green, because that's the color that the officers wear, and you don't want to be confused with someone who works there. And when you enter a prison, in a lot of cases, they give you a short speech. They say, if you should be taken hostage, you will not necessarily get rescued. Our job is to keep people behind bars, not to let them out. Part of that speech is to keep us on our toes and keep us watching our backs. And part of it is recognition that prisons can be dangerous places. So in 2012, I traveled to, I'm going to have to move ahead here. A couple of images. This is Fresno County Jail. In 2012, I traveled to Pelican Bay State Prison. After months of negotiating about why did we want to visit this prison, what kind of stories were we going to do, I forgot to turn on. How much more time do I have? 15 minutes. Okay. I just wanted to, I have my own timer. And our track record as journalists, we finally got the go-ahead, and a pretty generous one at that. We were given permission to spend 2 days inside. So we drove 6 hours to Crescent City, which is about as remote as you can get without leaving California. It's right up on the border of Oregon. And just an aside, I love how when you Google it, it says it's open 24 hours. It's a 24-hour operation. Here's a shot of the drive up to Crescent City. Pelican Bay is a supermax prison that was built in 1989. It was one of the first of its kind, the first supermax design in the country. It was built sort of in the middle of a surge of get tough on crime sentiment, where you had politicians saying, lock them up and throw away the key. You never know, what these people will do if given the chance. And these are just drawings or photos of the construction site. Pelican Bay was meant to be home to the worst of state criminals. And architecturally, it's pretty interesting. It's a compound of squat 2-story only buildings that are designed to be sort of impenetrable, inescapable. In particular, what Pelican Bay is known for are their isolation units, what they call security housing units, or SHUs. They don't call them solitary confinement. They call them isolation units. And they say that they put prisoners here who couldn't make it in the more general prison system, who either assaulted other prisoners, or in many cases they suspect of gang activity. The rules of the SHU. Every inmate has a cell to himself. There are no windows. The cell doors are made of a perforated metal that allows sound to pass, but nothing really bigger than like a pencil. Prisoners eat all of their meals inside the cell. They can never be inside a cell with another prisoner. If they should get a visitor, like a family member, which is rare, there is still some kind of physical barrier. They're also not, the guards cannot be inside the cell with them. There are not allowed phone calls. For a very long time, they were not allowed photographs of family members or friends. That policy has changed recently. All of their mail is carefully opened and inspected for contraband and pornographic material. And in other words, they have almost no physical contact with other human beings. And many of these prisoners spend years and years behind bars. I think this man probably has been inside for about 18 years. Prisoners are entitled to about an hour and a half of time outside their cell every day, roughly. It's kind of like, I think on the weekends it's less time. They use that time, they can leave their cells to shower and to work out in an exercise room, always by themselves. Getting from one place to another is a complicated ritual. Their shoes, they have to strip off their shoes and their clothing, pass it through this slot, and have it inspected for hidden items. And then they put it back on, all under the watchful eyes of officers. And then they are first shackled without even exiting the cell. They're shackled through the slot. Then the wrist shackles are put on a belly chain. A SHU prisoner always has to be accompanied by 2 officers at all times. The cells are clustered in pods, and the doors to the cell are opened by an officer in a control room somewhere else. So these 2 men here can't actually get the door open and shut, someone else does it. And then to exit the pod itself, another door is opened again by an officer up in a control tower that can observe this. And the idea is that there's no point in the prisoner overwhelming his escort because he still can't get out. They don't have the keys. For me, filming with the prisoners was was complicated. During the interview, not only were they fully shackled, but I think we had probably 4 officers in the room with us, and the door was locked, so none of us could get out. It had to be opened up by somebody else outside. I really wanted to show what the conditions were like inside Pelican Bay. I'd been inside enough prison cells to know that, in fact, their cells alone are not that harsh. Compared to older prisons like San Quentin, their cells are spacious. And they were originally designed to house there's 2 bunks in there, but each prisoner gets it all to themselves. So it wasn't just that. So what kind of stood out for me as an emblematic image of the kind of restrictions that the prisoners face was to actually look at what happens to them in their small little blocks of freedom, in the small blocks of time that they spend in an exercise cell. And the exercise cell is looks a lot like any other cell. It's 4 walls and a plain floor and a glimpse of the sky. So, of course, we cannot be inside the cell at the same time as a prisoner is inside the cell. So the public information officer at Pelican Bay suggested an idea, I thought was very creative. He said, why don't you tack a GoPro camera up inside the cell, you put it up in there before the prisoner enters, and then you leave, and then the prisoner spends his time inside, and then when he is done with his time, you go back in and you retrieve the GoPro. And this is just a digression, but the GoPro has really allowed us to get images from locations we wouldn't normally be able to get. And I think it's become very common. It's now part of the common vocabulary. You put the GoPro on your dirt bike and you get this very interesting perspectives. So that is what we did. This is Jeremy Beasley, and this is the slot through which we could look. And I'm going to play a clip from the video that we got with the GoPro camera. Thought that was good. I tried plugging it in earlier and it didn't work. Okay, here we go. So he enters, but he's still shackled, so he has to get unshackled through that slot. have no idea what he's doing. I'm going to go ahead and stop it. Interestingly, a lot of people, when they watch this video, watch it for almost 3 minutes. So I was going to make you do that too, but which surprises me. I mean, it's 3 minutes of not very interesting anything, but it kind of gets you in that space. When we interviewed Jeremy Beasley, we asked him when was the last time he saw the moon. And he had to pause and think about it. And he said 1998. To me, talk about image as location. The moon, the outdoor night sky, is something that he hasn't seen and can't see. And he can't visit it anymore, except through his own imagination, except through the memories in his own mind. These shoes have been the subject of a lot of contention, a lot of protest, and there's a current class action lawsuit taking place. That man is involved in it. Some say that the prisoners are being punished for their activism for racial reasons, like Marie Levin here, who says her brother is being unfairly targeted for his attempts to improve conditions inside prison. But prison officials say that these are dangerous gangs, members of notorious prison gangs like the Mexican Mafia or the Aryan Brotherhood. I have to admit, I don't exactly know myself what I think of it. It's, Jeremy Beasley, for example, when we interviewed him, said that if they'd put him back in a mainline prison, he probably would kill somebody or at least stab somebody. There was another prisoner who used to have a cellmate, but that cellmate ended up dead with his head bashed in on the metal bunk, so then that cellmate needed to be put in one of these units. I don't think a shoe is going to make Jeremy Beasley a better person, but I also don't really know how we can handle people who, are dangerous. But ultimately, I hope that my work bringing these images out can help all of us talk about it and discuss it. In fact, prison does a curious reversal on the whole idea of image as location. Because of its location, it removes images from our collective perception and understanding. The common saying, out of sight, out of mind. Prisons and incarceration do exactly that. For victims of crime, prison can be very important. Removing somebody from society, putting them out of circulation, it's a safety net. I interviewed this woman, Bridget Nevin, whose father was killed with 24 blows to his head with a wrench by a former employee. She feels safer knowing that her father's killer is somewhere far away where he can't hurt anybody again, at least for now. On the other hand, once people are behind bars, their stories are removed from circulation. I've been working on a series of stories about people convicted of relatively minor crimes, but whose sentences have been, oh, that's her father, sorry. Whose sentences have been relatively whopping. There is, in fact, a voters' initiative on the ballot this November, Prop 47, that seeks to lower certain kind of nonviolent drug offenses from a felony to a misdemeanor, in an attempt to bring the punishment more in line with crime. And this is sort of the other end of the pendulum. We had the supermaxes, now we have people looking at how much money we spend locking people up and saying, do we really need to do this? This is not the first time that, we have laws like Prop 47. I interviewed this man, Forrest, who is still doing time at San Quentin. He's a third striker. That means he's doing 25 years to life on a third strike. And his third strike was stealing a VCR from someone's home. But he had 2 prior convictions. He had petty with a prior. And he was, a drug addict. His life wasn't a pretty one. But he says, he's learned his lesson and he is ready to live a better life. He has also been very activist in some of these these legislations to change the law, and he's been doing it by working for the San Quentin News, which is a newspaper written by inmates. And that's kind of his way of projecting his image of the world, of his sense of justice back out. And you know, the inmates publish this paper, it's quite good, without the benefit of internet, because you're not allowed to have access to the internet in prison. Speaking of lifers, what most people may not realize is that they do eventually get out. They are usually much older, which means they're a lot less likely to reoffend. These are all lifers. But age brings its own challenges: estrangement from family, no real job skills, health problems. Take James Ward. He has done 32 years for killing his ex-girlfriend. His image of the world is from 3 decades ago, when there were no cell phones, minimal computers, no ATMs. He's heard about all these things through his fellow prisoners, from visitors, from counselors. But for him, the outside world is just an image. And whether he will succeed when he gets out is going to be, it'll be tricky. He'll need a lot of support. Many prisoners I've talked to describe a mindset that occurs when you spend a long time in one rarefied location. This is David Hillary, who is now out on parole. Again, it's a role reversal. Being inside a location creates a set of values that function only inside that environment. This man did 18 years for second-degree murder, but he was found suitable for parole after 18 years, and he's still in his early 40s. He's got his whole life in front of him. That said, he said it took a really long time for him to understand that the mindset that he shared with, call it 100,000 other prisoners in the state of California, was a really tiny subset of what we consider normal, and that getting out, he's had to really kind of reconsider. Like, there's millions of other people out there who don't think like I do. He's doing really well, by the way, and James Ward will parole on November 5th. Here's Hillary teaching a class for other recovering drug addicts. Finally, how much? Down to 1 minute? Okay, well, I'll make this really quick. This is kind of a more artistic, interpretive take on prisons and incarceration, and that is the exhibit by Ai Weiwei on Alcatraz. How many people have seen it? So then you know that he deals a lot with themes of confinement and freedom within that confinement. He himself was detained for 81 days in 2011 on alleged tax evasion charges. His supporters say it's because he's been so openly critical of the Chinese government. And for him doing this exhibit, I got to interview him as part of the story that I did. For him doing the exhibit was also, he had to understand Alcatraz through images, because he is under a kind of house arrest. His passport was confiscated, he can't leave China. So he had to look at videos, images, photos, even popular films in which Alcatraz features in designing his exhibit. And the question that I will end on with Ai Weiwei and his exhibit, and I'm just going to power through these images, is the degree to which he, as an artist, his confinement, the limitations placed on him, the degree to which they almost enhance his ability to make the messages that he makes in his artwork. He did a whole piece about prisoners of conscience, some well-known names: Martin Luther King, Edward Snowden, but also unknown names, people that we don't know, and that his whole thesis is, you forget what they're fighting for because they're in prison, and you will forget who they are. And for him, there is, to me, there's an added star power to the fact that he can't leave physically, but his ideas can get out into the world at large. Here he is in the studio in Beijing. So.
Thank you. So, please come this way.
Okay.
So, more slides. So now I'm sure there's some questions for Monica. Thank you for your talk. And after your talk, there's going to be another talk by Stephen Johnson. and he's about to show up, and Ken Goldberg is going to introduce him, and I'm going to introduce Ken. But that's what's going to happen just now. It's a little bit of a transition because that conference is, that talk is part of 2 conferences. So back to you, Monica. Let's see if there's any questions from audience members about inside, outside.
Yeah.
Microphone?
Thank you. My question is very short. I'm curious to know whether your own image of prison or being imprisoned has changed after these 2 days being there.
That's a great question. I was chatting earlier with some other people about it. What was actually really weird for me was how quickly the prison environment became normal for me. When I first went in, it was kind of shocking. Oh my gosh, all of these rules and restrictions. But what was even more shocking to me was that at the end of 2 days, how normal everything had become. And that it was only as I left Pelican Bay and kind of went back out into the sunshine that there was this moment of like, whoa, no, that isn't normal. You know, that's not how people normally live. So.
Next question. Kristen.
This is sort of more of a comment, but maybe it's something you could respond to. I was struck by the challenge that you must have working within the prison system to find all of the restrictions of how you can take images or the spaces that you have to record images and the access that you have, like the limitations to be able to tell the story of the experience that you want to convey, like the limitations sometimes of like both the structure that prevents you from, I mean, that gives you a lot of restrictions, and also just the restrictions of the image to convey and tell a story.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's an example of like, you trying to work this out with the system and how, like what the process was like.
That's an interesting question, because I think what I found was that all the hoops kind of happened before I even got inside, and that something about the normalization of prison life worked in my favor. So that once I was inside and we were all kind of just in this environment, what I found was that the wardens and the corrections officers, that they were actually incredibly relaxed. So they would give me lots of rules up front. You can't talk to the inmates. That's always what they tell you when you first go inside. And before you know it, the officers talk to the inmates all the time. So then they do it, and then I do it, and then all of a sudden we're all just kind of hanging out. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but there was something about the normalization effect that then made it easier for me to do my work.
We have one more. Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing all these materials too with us. I was curious about one aspect you mentioned at some moment where you asked this inmate about when he had last seen the moon, and you said he had to resort to his imagination. And I wondered if you had, in your work, reflected upon this dimension of imagination within the creation of space, because here you talked about very precise dimensions of this physical space, but it seems that these inmates, especially in supermaxes, modify their space by the practice, also bodily practice, because otherwise it would be unbearable if you could not actually modify through imagination the space you're in. And I was thinking of a very interesting speech I heard by Lisa Günther, who's a philosopher working on body phenomenology in the supermax space, and apparently on these practices, how you can actually change by the way in which you move the perception of this extremely confined space, which would otherwise make such a life unbearable. So I just wanted to ask whether this had been a topic you had been thinking upon.
I do think about it. I feel like even though I've spent more time inside prisons than kind of the average person, I don't think I know what it's really like to spend years and years of your life in there. I think what happens to people is they get kind of psychologically screwed up. They make adaptations to this space that are not in and of themselves healthy, because it's not that healthy of an environment to be in. So I don't know that they're like able to kind of do what you're talking about. And it's pretty well, we see it all the time when people get out of prison. They have a really hard time adjusting to life on the outside. and that the freedom that they valued and looked forward to for so long. Even kind of low-level crimes, so not very dangerous people, not shoes. They have a hard time dealing with ordering food in a restaurant, ordering their day, figuring out what to do next, figuring out like things kind of are sequential, because in prison nothing's sequential and everything is you're told what to do and when to do it. So. And we probably have time for one more question, but I just wanted to make an announcement quickly. We are raffling, Citrus, the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society, is raffling off tickets for a copy of Stephen Johnson's book, How We Got to Now. So if you're interested in a ticket, I'm going to be walking around. Just raise your hand and I'll pass you a little coupon. And but at any rate, one more question for Monica.
Right behind you.
Right behind.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the fact that you paid attention to something that we rarely pay attention to and got to see from the inside. What I was particularly struck by was the fact that the inmates that were working to create a more expansive space, ideologically perhaps, they were trying to fight for greater space, not only for themselves but for others, were being targeted, it seemed, to be confined even more. And so I'm really interested in that piece of it and the political kind of aspect of what you perceive to be ways that they were being subjected to a different level of scrutiny, perhaps, in a narrower space that they had to inhabit.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I can just add to it, which is that I think one of the scarier things that we all imagine is being locked up unfairly, and either being convicted of a crime you didn't commit, and that kind of reaches into that space, right? Like if you're just trying to organize for better conditions and then you get punished for that, that seems unfair. Forrest Jones, the third striker who stole the VCR, I think he's been very activist, so he's worked very hard to like make change in the law. But again, it's this sense of like, once you are inside a prison, you lose all your rights. I think you have a right to food, shelter, and medical care. I think that's it. I don't think you have a right to anything else. No rehab, no education, and no, this discussion about what would be good conditions, certainly not. So, thank you all.
Wait,
You told me one more question.
We'll leave it. So our next speaker is going to be Stephen Johnson, and I believe he's going to be here in about, maybe he's already here. No? And Ken Goldberg's going to introduce him. And so actually we do have time for one more question because they're not here yet. So if you don't mind, I'm going to reboot this a little bit, and because I'm conférencier, I get to do these kinds of things. And I was going to ask you one question about tattoos as images that prisoners can make. And you've commented on tattoos before. It's really the only canvas they have is their body in a way. And can you say something about tattoos in prison?
Maybe you should say something about tattoos in prison.
I know nothing about either, but I'm curious.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of homemade tattooing where I think you get ink and needles and you tattoo yourself. Here's an interesting tattoo story. It doesn't really answer your question, but one of the men I interviewed in Pelican Bay, we actually begun a written correspondence, and so he had mailed to me the justification form that the corrections, the CDCR, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, had written up to justify why he was in a shoe. And it had this tiny little drawing in there, because it's just a little form with lots of questions. It had this tiny little form of like a bar with 3 dots above it, right? The little drawing, the Mayan numeral 13. And when I read this letter, I was like, yeah, how ridiculous, a tiny tattoo of that size. And then when I got inside and I saw his tattoo, it was like this huge tattoo that covered up like a portion of his arm. He was a big guy, so it was just like gigantic Mayan numeral 13. And when I saw that, I thought, sometimes you got to see with your own eyes. And it's a little hard to say that is not a gang tattoo, but I'll let I'll let him argue that one.
Good. You have one more question here, Anne? Go ahead.
Not exactly image, but I'm wondering if you heard, it really amazes me what confined spaces the acoustics are like. I mean, you heard the ball. I'm wondering if any of them sing or hum or have basically, they have that acoustic control. And I'm not sure that they use it or if they do have, if they have to be quiet all the time. I mean, that's sort of another cut.
I've not heard people singing. I think it's a great idea. I don't know that the prison culture would encourage it, but it's a great idea. Maybe you could go and teach them music classes. I have heard about kind of scarier things where prisoners in San Quentin. So San Quentin, weirdly enough, is like one of the most kind of amazing. It's like a country club. There's like Shakespeare for prisoners and baseball. There's the newspaper. You go inside, everybody's like hanging around, going to classes, moving around freely, and it's also where death row is housed. And I can't remember what time of day this happens at, but I was in there once when there was this really kind of scary chanting. They call it cadence. And so the death row prisoners are in their own isolation cells by themselves, and they're working out together, and they're chanting. And you hear this bizarre, muffled chanting. So they do use sound, but I don't know about music.
All right, let's end it there. Thank you so much, Monica.
Thanks again.